You know, it would be wonderful as Christians if we could just always live spiritually on a mountaintop. That, you know, every day was just a beautiful, wonderful day, that there were no problems and no issues in our lives. It would just be fabulous if we could live, metaphorically speaking, that is, on this proverbial mountaintop. But, you know, that's not possible. The reality is that we've got to come down into the valley. We've got to come down where people are. We've got to come down where there are problems, and we've got to deal with those problems on a regular basis each and every day of our lives. Now, some days are going to be certainly better than others. But the text from Ephesians 3 that was read in your hearing momentarily, when you look at those verses, what you got to realize is what Paul is doing in these verses is he's taking us, as it were, out of the valley, out of the problems and out of the issues of life, and he's setting us on this mountaintop where we can see the grandeur and the glory of God in a real way that's going to affect us and impact us in our daily lives. That's what the text is all about here. And so what we're able to do in this text, and I hope that you can see this, so what we're able to do in this text is we can see the fact that as Christians, the hand of God is in our lives in a very real way. And that's what I think is the beauty of this. When we recognize breathtakingly the God that we serve and how interested in us He is, it is that which is able to lift us out of the valley and set us, as it were, on that proverbial mountaintop. I got to tell you, here's what I come to realize, and I realize it is possibly that's going to be the case here, but I realize it almost in every place that I am privileged to go. That there's so many of us as Christians, ladies and gentlemen, that we just live our lives as though God is detached from us. It's kind of like living in an empty building where there is no furnishings, there's nothing in that but just simply empty rooms. This is the way that we often live our lives, devoid entirely of the presence of God. Now, I'm not talking about the presence of God in some miraculous way, but I'm just talking about the fact that God is involved in our lives in a real, practical sort of way. Now, the text that the young brother read from Ephesians chapter 3, I want you to notice, is actually a prayer. Paul is dealing with these Christians by means of praying for them. Now notice, he said, "For this reason I bow my knee to the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ." That's verse 14. But what you need to realize is that in chapter 1, he also prays for these Christians and us by extension. If you look over in chapter 1, he said in verse 15, "Therefore I also, after I heard of your faith in the Lord Jesus Christ and your love for all the saints, do not cease to give thanks for you, making mention of you in my prayers." Now I want you to notice in the first prayer in chapter 1 what he prays for. He says, "I want your eyes to be opened. I want the eyes of your understanding to be enlightened." Well, Paul, what is it that you want us to be able to see? Well, I want your eyes to be opened, enlightened, so that you can see, or you may know rather, what is the hope of his calling, and what are the riches of the glory of his inheritance, and what is the exceeding greatness of his power toward us. So what Paul is doing here, this is what's so interesting to me. So what Paul is doing in the first prayer, he says, I want you people to open your eyes, and I want you to be cognizant of, I want you to be aware of the great power of God. And then what he does in chapter 3, he prays that now I want you to tap into that power. I want you to be able to reference that power, to attach yourself to that power. I want you to tap into that power. Use the power of God. You're God's people. I want you to notice something else about this. In verse 14 of chapter 3, he starts out with these three words, "for this reason." What reason? What reason? Well, I want you to notice now, chapter 3 actually begins in verse 1 with those same three words. For this reason. And so what we need to do is we need to, as diligent students of the Bible, we need to, well, what reason? We need to find out what reason he's talking about. Well, we have to go back up into chapter 2 just a little bit, and we'll start at verse 19, because this gives us the reason, for this reason. Well, it said, now therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building, being fitted together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together for a dwelling place of the Spirit of God. What he's saying is, you need to understand, you are the people of God. You are the dwelling of God. God dwells among you. You are the people of God. And so this is that reason that we're to tap into this power of God. You're the house, you're the habitation of God. And I tell you what I so appreciate about this is that it reminds me that, ladies and gentlemen, we serve a living, compassionate, tender, involved, accessible God. And I tell you, that is absolutely amazing when you think about it. And Paul prays, he prays that Christians may somehow recognize, I guess I need to turn this on if I'm going to use it, that we need to recognize that we can gain all of this from the riches of his glory. And that's really what we're being told here, that Christians can access God's power through the riches of his glory. And something I want you to notice about Ephesians, and that the book of Ephesians, often we look at it as just a commentary on the church and the glorious nature of the church, and this is true. However, it is also a book that is, in my estimation, just a treasure trove of God's riches. And that's what makes this text so amazing to me. Now just think about it. There's several places in the book of Ephesians it talks about the riches of God, riches of his grace in chapter 1 and verse 7, the riches of the glory of his inheritance, riches of his grace and his kindness. It's a treasure trove. It's a treasure chest of the riches of God, the unsearchable riches of Christ. And as he says here in our text, the riches of his glory. I hope that means something to you. I hope it's something that can reach in and just kind of touch your heart and tug at the heartstrings. Because what God is telling us, I have an abundance of riches that I want to bestow upon you. Don't live in this empty building any longer. Access these riches. They are abundant for you. I think of God much like the father of the prodigal son in the 15th chapter of Luke. You remember, who was willing to divide his inheritance with his sons. I think of what the Apostle Paul said in writing to the Romans in Romans chapter 8 and verse 17, that we're heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. And I think of what the psalmist records in Psalm 50 and verse 12, that the world is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And what God is saying is, I want you as my people to share in these riches that are abundantly available to you. Now, let's stay in our text here, and let's notice that what he does now is give us a progression of these riches and what they mean to us and how they are to affect our lives. And let's notice now, as we go back to verse 16, what he's telling us there is that we, as God's people, we can be strengthened with might through his Spirit in the inner man. That's what we need. If we're going to be sustained here upon this earth and serve God amidst all that's going on, I'm going to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, we need to be strengthened in the power of His might through the Spirit in the inner man, the inner person. And this is something that's available to us. And so many people, it is sad. So many people go through their lives never strengthened by God. And all you got to do is just think about the reality of this. How many of us are living in unhappy homes? Things at home are just falling apart. And a lot of people don't even know what's going on because we hide that when we come to services like this. But in reality, we're just kind of limping along in unhappy homes. We can't solve conflicts. Inability to get along with other people. Sometimes we just simply cannot hold jobs. We can't resist temptation. We just filled with doubt and filled with anxiety. And so when these things begin to happen, and these are the problems that I'm talking about, where we live, not on the mountaintop, but in the valley where there are problems. And so when we have these kind of problems, what do? I'll tell you what happens a lot of times. Younger people, maybe some of us older ones as well, we'll turn to promiscuity. Looking to get out of this valley, we'll turn to alcohol, we'll turn to drugs, we'll turn to something that's going to be able to lift us out of the dredges that we're feeling in our lives. Sometimes we turn to agnosticism or atheism. Sometimes we just turn to apathy. We just turn off. We just burn out, as it were. So what's the answer to this? The answer is don't turn to those things. Turn to God. The power is there if we will just plug in. Be strengthened by the power of His might through His Spirit in the inner man. And when we talk about the inner man, what we're talking about is the real you. Now, Vernon dealt with some of this morning in the excellent Bible class that we were privileged to sit through. But he's dealing with the real us, the inner person, not the tent, not the tabernacle that we're able to see on a daily basis. Now, that's what we take care of. We focus upon the outer man, do we not? We wash it, we clothe it, we comb it, we brush it, we exercise it, because we're taking care of the outer man. And then I'll tell you what happens. When reality sets in and we look in the mirror and we realize, this outer man is decaying. This outer man is, on a downward slide, a demise, then it begins to upset us. But what we need to do, and God has the power, what we need to do, ladies and gentlemen, is focus upon the inner man. We need to strengthen the inner man, as Paul talked about in 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 16. We need to be, renewed in the inner man. We need to be strengthened because the outer man is wasting away. Remember what Paul said in Romans chapter 12 and verse 2? He said, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Now, this is where we need to be. We need to start in the mind. We need to be renewed in the mind and strengthen the inner man. And the more that we focus upon the inner man, the less problem we have when we realize the outer man is decaying. That's because we've been strengthened internally. Well, how do we go about doing it? Well, by His Spirit, by the power of His might. Somebody said, well, how does that take place, J.R.? What exactly are you talking about here? When you talk about being strengthened by His Spirit, now we're not talking about some miraculous strengthening here. We're talking about something that God has provided for us that's very, very powerful and very, 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 very practical. You remember in Galatians chapter 5 and in verse 16 what the Apostle Paul says. He said, walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. Walk in the Spirit. Be strengthened in the inner man by the power of God through His Spirit. Well, how does this come about? Well, let me give you a couple of passages here to mull over. In Ephesians 5 and verse 18, the Apostle Paul reminds these same Christians, do not be drunk with wine, wherein is dissipation, but rather he says, be filled with the Spirit. Be filled with the Spirit. Then he goes on to say in verse 19, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. And we know the passage. We deal with that. And making melody in our heart to the Lord. Okay, let me step away from that and give you a companion passage. And it's going to kind of help us understand where I'm going with this. Remember what he said in verse 18, do not be drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit. Speaking to one another, psalms, hymns, spiritual songs. Now, let's go to Colossians chapter 3. And in Colossians chapter 3 and in verse 16, the Apostle Paul says, let the words of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. So you see, when you take these companion passages together, you need to understand that the more that I'm strengthened by the words of Christ dwelling in my heart, the more that I'm filled with the Spirit of God, and the more that I'm renewing the inner man daily. This is how this comes about. It's not something that takes a rocket scientist to understand. The Word of God, Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 12, is sharp, it's alive, it's living, it's powerful. It is able to connect us to the power of God, to be able to endure the problems of this life, and to see the grandeur and the glory of God. I'm going to tell you the truth of the matter is, if I have no spiritual energy, if I have burned out, or I am about to flame out, you know what the problem is? The problem is that I have not been renewed in the inner man by the power of God's Word that was revealed by the Spirit of God. Lady, one time, I got to tell you this. I was in a gospel meeting in northern Indiana several years ago, staying with the preacher up there. And we got a call one day. One of the ladies in the congregation there wanted to meet with us because she wanted some advice. So we go over and we meet with her. And I got to tell you, I'm basically an upbeat person. I really am. I'm optimistic, and I like to live my life that way. I really do. And so when we met with this woman, she was one of these downers. You know what I'm talking about? I mean, it was a woe is me, and I was hearing all kinds of dark, despondent, depressed kinds of things, you know, and her life was just on a downward spiral. And she was depressed, and every day she just got bluer and bluer and lower and lower and lower. And I mean, it was to the point that I was getting that way. And so finally, you know, and the brother that I'm with, you know, he's trying his best to just kind of, you know, talk her through and walk her through all of this. And so finally I asked her, you know, sometimes you have to be careful about what you ask because the answer you get you don't expect. And so finally, I asked her, I said, well, sister, let me ask you this. I said, when you're feeling as despondent as you are presently, I said, what do you do to try to get out of that pit? What do you do? And she said, well, when I get this way, she said, about the only thing that I can do is I play card games on the computer. You know, I wanted to say, well, how's that working out for you? But I didn't. I said, well, you know, there's something better than playing, you know, solitary on a computer. But this is where we are sometimes. We're dealing with the realities of life, and God has already said, I have an abundance of riches for you. And if you will tap into the power that the Spirit has revealed in the words of Christ and fill your heart and your mind with the teachings of this word, it will enable you to get out of this burnout feeling of depression that you have. See, this is progressive. This is where it starts. And I want you to know now where it progresses to. He says, now going back to our text, and this time in verse 17, now remember, always talking about you've been strengthened by the power of the Spirit. In verse 16, that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you being rooted and grounded in love, that Christ may dwell in your hearts through or by faith. I love this part. I love this part of our text. I really do. Because it's so challenging to me. And I hope it is to you as well. Because a lot of times, you know what we do? And I'm not being critical of this because I think it's a good thing that we want to get into the Word. We want to unpackage the Word. We want to understand the Word. We want to try to make the correct applications to the Word. And so sometimes when it comes to dealing with this word dwell, that Christ may dwell in your heart through, that, it causes us to, whoa, I wonder how that comes about. Christ dwelling in your heart through and by faith. How does Christ dwell in you? So we kind of, hash this around. We talk about it. We debate it. We discuss it. And that's good. I have no problems with that. But I don't want us to lose sight of what he's saying here because it's tremendous. So I've set that up this way. So let me ask you a question. What does dwell mean? Well, what does dwell mean? When you just kind of look at the word and try to understand this word dwell, then it's going to open up a good meaning of what we're talking about here. But kind of help you answer the question, I'll put it like this. My wife, Sue, who's with me this morning, we dwell together. We dwell together. I said, well, sure, that's what dwell means. It means to dwell. It means to live together. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. When we talk about Christ dwelling in our hearts through faith, what that says is Christ lives in our hearts. Now, I'm not talking about that Jesus somehow has escaped from heaven. He comes down, physically gets into this pump in my chest. I'm not talking about that. I'm kind of talking about what Paul mentions in Galatians 2 and verse 20 when he said, I've been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loves me and gave himself for me. So the idea here is that Christ lives in our heart comfortably. He resides in my heart, in the inner man, in my mind, in my spirit. He resides in there comfortably. He is at home in my heart. Are you following me on this? Christ is at home in my heart. And I'll tell you what that looks like. That means that he loves what I love. That means that his view of sin is my view of sin. You get that? He's comfortable in my heart. He lives in my heart. Let me tell you, now, I don't endorse this translation categorically, but I want to just tell you how the Amplified Bible translates verse 17. The Amplified Bible says, actually, speaking of Christ dwelling in our hearts, actually settles down, abides, make his permanent home in our hearts. Now, let me ask you this. Could you say that Jesus dwells comfortably in your heart? What I mean by that, does Jesus feel at home in your heart? I see, this is what scares me. Does Jesus feel comfortable going where I go? Does Jesus feel comfortable looking at what I look at? Does Jesus feel comfortable seeing the movies that I see, listening to the music that I hear? Does Jesus feel comfortable? Does he feel at home in my heart? You see, this is what I want us to see about dwelling in your heart by or through faith. And I'll tell you, I can tell you this. I didn't have the privilege that many of you have of being raised by godly Christian parents. I love my mom and dad, don't misunderstand, but we were not Christians. I was not taken to church as a child. As a matter of fact, I tell people that before I went into the Army, that I probably had attended church services of any kind maybe 5 times in my life. And so I did a lot of things that I'm ashamed of. And I involved myself in a lot of things that I wished I had not by knowing better. Well, after I become a Christian, the guys that I knew, the guys that I worked with, they knew how I was and what I did and where I would go and what I would involve myself in. And they saw a change. But here's what they would do. We'd get off from work, we'd be getting ready to get off from work, and some of us carpool together. And some of the guys would say, now, JR said, we're going to stop down here at, they named this little bar, and we're going to stop and we're going to unwind and we're going to get a beer. And so we'd like for you to stop with us. I said, guys, you know I don't drink. We get it. We know you don't drink. You're a Christian now. Yeah, we got all of that. But you don't have to drink. You can just go with us and you can have a soft drink and we'll just sit around and unwind and we'll go home. I said, no, I'm not going. I'm not going. Well, why not? We're not asking you to go and do something wrong. We're just asking you to go and be with us. We may be drinking. You don't do that. You can have a Coke or you can have a soda or something. You don't have to do that. I said, no, I'm not going. And so they didn't understand this, and a lot of times they would just kind of hurl some what they thought were accusations against me. Oh, yeah, I get it. I know how you Christians are. I know how you holy rollers are. You're just too good. You're just too good to be with your old friends. And, you know, sometimes that intimidates us, doesn't it? You know what my response to them was? No. You guys have got it all wrong. I'm not too good to be with you. I'm not too good to go in there with you. But I'll tell you what, he who lives in my heart is too good for me to take in there, and I'm not taking him. This is what it means for Christ to live in your hearts through faith. He's comfortable doing what you do. Oh, if we could just see that I'll have the same attitude toward these things that my Lord has. He lives comfortably in my heart. But I'm going to tell you something. Jesus will not invade. He will not invade our heart. He has to be invited in. I stand at the door and knock. And if anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him. And I'll dine with him. I'll have fellowship with him. And he with me. Oh, what a progression here. What a beautiful scene that we're seeing here from Ephesians chapter 3. Starting out, you be renewed in the spirit of your mind, but in the inner man. And then let Christ comfortably live in your hearts and feel at home in your heart. And then he says, when you do this, you're going to be able to comprehend what is incomprehensible. And I know I'm speaking in contradictory terms here. I get that. But I want you to understand what Paul is saying here. He said, and you may be able in verse 18 now. We've moved down from 16 to 17. Now we're in 18. May be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the width and length and depth and height, to know the love of Christ, which does what? Which passes understanding. You know what it is? What I'm going to be able to do, I'm going to understand that which is not able to be understood. I'm going to be able to comprehend that which is incomprehensible. I mean, we talk about the love of Christ, and obviously we need to spend a lot of time talking about the love of Christ, the love of God, because we couldn't do enough justice if we talked about it every day. I'm confident of that. But you know, we can start out the heart of the gospel, John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. That is amazing in and of itself. But when you couple that with what Jesus said in John 15 and verse 13, greater love than this has no one than to lay down his life for a friend, then we're being able to kind of get a little bit of grip on this. And then we would add such passages as Romans 5 and verse 8, that God demonstrated his love toward us, and while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And somebody said, well, yeah, JR, those are passages I understand, and those are passages that I comprehend. And so what do you talk about, comprehend the incomprehensible? What do you mean by that? I understand the love of God. You know what we do? I say we, I should say me. I can't possibly look into your heart. But you know what I often do is I often get stuck with the mechanics of God's love. And what I mean by the mechanics of it, just the very basic understanding of God's love. God so loved the world. God commended his love toward us. Jesus loved me and he laid down his life for me. Those are things that impress me. They're things that drive me. They're things that warm my heart. But my friends, when we begin to mentally experience this love in a way that Paul is talking about here, it has a profound effect upon us. It changes us. That's why John could say in 1 John chapter 4 and verse 19, we love him because he first loved us. Well, what kind of love did he have for us? Well, he had sacrificial love. We talk about it. That's right, and that's true. But again, that's the mechanics. That's the basis of this. You remember when Paul was giving the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5, you remember what he starts with? The fruit of the Spirit is love. He starts with love. And I don't think that's by accident. I think that's on purpose, don't you? That this is the fruit of the Spirit is love. Passage we looked at this morning in Bible class, you remember, is 2 Corinthians 5, verse 14. The love of Christ compels us. The love of Christ compels us. You know what's interesting about that word compel, and I know you understand it because I heard some different translations this morning in class. That word in the Greek that's translated compels is such an interesting word because you can find even some obscure translations that it says the love of Christ constrains us. Compels, constrains, compels, constrains. Aren't they two opposites? You know, compels us, that pushes us in the direction we ought to go. Constrains us, that keeps us from going where we ought not go. And that's why the translations now say controls us. It's that which controls us entirely. And this is the kind of love that Paul is talking about here in Ephesians chapter 3. Now let's think about this. Let's go back to this. Look at verse 18 once again. And comprehend with all the saints. Now he notices 4 different directions here that he goes. He says the width, the length, the depth, and the height. He's talking about the love of Christ. And I want you to stop and think about it this way. How wide is the love of Christ? Isn't that an interesting question? Well, you may say, well, it might be to you, JR. That's kind of dumb to me. But hey, I want us to think about that. I want us to think about the breadth or the width of the love of Christ. How wide is the love of Christ? Well, Paul answers that in this treasure trove of Ephesians. He said, now you go back to chapter 2. And he says, really beginning at verse 11, I'll not read all of these verses, but he's talking to the Gentiles here. You know, you were aliens from God. You were not part of God's chosen people, but now, he says, you have been brought near. So how wide is the love of Christ? It is so wide that it includes Jew and Gentile, you and me. It doesn't make any difference the color of our skin. It doesn't make any difference the gender that we are. The love of Christ is broad enough to cover all of lost humanity. That thrills my heart. Christianity is not a Western religion. It is not an ethnic religion. It is a religion that is so broad it would encompass the whole world. That's how broad, that's how wide the love of Christ is. And I'll tell you something, how that affects me. How that affects me is that He loves me. I'm part of this. And you know what? I'm going to love others. I'm going to love everybody. And I'm going to try to share with everybody the love of Christ, because that's how wide the love of Christ is. And you know what? That's hard for some people to comprehend. Well, he not only talks about the width, he talks about the length. How long? How long? How long is the love of Christ? And somebody said, well, that too is an irresponsible question. How do you measure the length of the love of Christ? Well, I'll tell you how we can do that. You look over in chapter 1 and verse 4. He chose us in Him before the foundation of the world. The love of Christ goes all the way back before creation. Before God ever made a clod of dirt, He looked down through time and He loved all of humanity. That's how long the love of God is, and I tell you, that changes me. That affects me in the most profound way. Well, he raises something else. He said that we can know the depth of God's love. How deep is the love of God? Well, we already noticed how wide it is to include everyone, and how long it is. It goes back before creation. Well, how in the world do you measure the depth of God's love? Well, look at what he says in chapter 2. He says that we were dead in trespasses and sins in verse 1. But God, who is rich in mercy because of His great love with which He loved us, verse 4. I'll tell you how deep the love of God is. The love of God is so deep that it doesn't matter how low in sin and how far we get bogged down in sin that we become, that God's love can't lift us out of that sin. I mentioned how I was raised. I'll tell you about my sister. My baby sister became an alcoholic. She ended up dying of stage 4 liver cancer due to her alcoholism. We lost touch with my baby sister for a number of years. I didn't know whether she was alive, whether she was dead. I had no idea what was going on in her life. Her life was a mess. She had 5 children by several different men. She gave many of them up for adoption. Her life was a mess. It was a shambles. But I'll tell you what happened. What happened was she came face to face with the gospel, and I had the opportunity to spend time in the little trailer that she lived in, teaching her the gospel of Christ, and I was able to see her become a Christian prior to her death. She called me one day after she had studied with some elders in the church down in Kentucky that we'd put her in touch with. And she calls me one day and she said, well, brother, I just want you to know. She said, I'm a new woman. I said, what? Yep, I'm a new woman. I said, honey, are you telling me, sis, that you were baptized? Yes, I just came back from the church building. My hair is still wet. And I tell you what, I was able to see and experience the depth of God's love that could save this woman whose life was a mess. And she died in hope. Things like that change us. Oh, do you see what we're doing? Paul is lifting us out of the world of trouble and sin and sorrow, and letting us see the hand of God in our lives. And now he talks about the height of God's love. Well, we've seen how wide and long and deep it is. How high is it? It's high enough to lift us up and set us right hand of God. It's able to lift us up and set us in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. That's how That's how high the love of God is. And when you can experience this, it will have a profound effect upon you. You will not be the same person that you were. Because what God is doing is lifting us higher and higher. It starts with the renewed spirit. Christ comfortably living in our hearts. And then comprehending what is incomprehensible in the world. Finally, we're able to see that now we can live with confidence. Confidence in the power of God. He said in verse 20, now to him who is able, let me just stop right there. You know the profundity of that? Now to him who is able, he's talking about God. He said to him who is able. God is able. God is able. And I got to tell you, my friends, we've got to be willing to trust that. And here's the thing: when I see that term "God is able," you know who I think of? I don't think of Cain and Abel, so don't go there. But I think God is able. I go back to Daniel 3, what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said when Nebuchadnezzar was threatening to throw them in the fiery furnace. And he said, now what God is going to be able to protect you from my hand? You remember what their response was? God is able. The God we serve is able. And as a result of that, they wouldn't bend and they wouldn't bow. And they were cast into the fiery furnace, and thank God they didn't burn. But I love what they said. God is able. And that ought to be enough for every one of us. We don't need to, we shouldn't have to go any further than that. You know where we are? I'm going to tell you where we are. We're sort of like the man with the demonic son in Mark chapter 9 and verse 24. Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. What? Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. Is that you? Would that be descriptive of us? I believe, but Lord, I want you to help my unbelief. Well, how is that? Well, let me show you how that works. I would be willing to say that every one of us in this room believes that God created the heavens and the earth in 6 24-hour days. I believe that. I believe God created the heavens and the earth in Genesis 1 in 6 24-hour days. I believe that, and you do too. And I'll tell you something else I believe. I believe that God destroyed the world with a flood with the saving of Noah and his household. I believe that. Don't you? And I tell you what, I believe that God delivered the children of Israel out of Egyptian captivity, and I believe He parted the Red Sea and they walked across as on dry land. Do you? I believe that, and I know you do too. I believe that Jesus raised dead Lazarus from the grave, and you do too. And I believe that Jesus conquered death, and 3 days after being crucified, He came up out of Joseph's tomb alive, and He sits and reigns at the right hand of God today. I believe that, don't you? Well, you said, well, surely I believe that. What does that to do with, I believe, help my unbelief? Well, here's the problem, and I don't know about you, but I sometimes have this problem. I look at all that God is able to do, all that God has done, and then for some reason I think God is impotent when it comes to solving my problems. What makes me think JR can have a problem so massive that God cannot handle it? Oh, maybe He will not calm the storm in my life, but He'll calm my heart that I may endure the storm. I believe. You know why I believe? Because God is able. But that's not all that He says. It should be enough, because I think about what Jeremiah said back in Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 17. Lord God, behold, you have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and outstretched arm. There is nothing too hard for you. God is able. But I want you to go back and notice what Paul says. He doesn't say that God is able, which ought to be enough. He said, God is able to do. Well, He has the power to act. Well, that should be enough. God is able. God is able to do. But He says God is able to do all that we ask. You see how He's building upon that? Now, this is the confidence that we have in Him, that if we ask according to His will, He hears us. 1 John 5 and verse 14. So God is able. God is able to do. God is able to do all that we ask. He's not done yet. He said God is able to do all that we ask and think. You know, He never lives to make intercession for. What a tremendous wealth that we have here. That ought to be enough, but He's not finished. God is able to do above all that we ask or think. And He's just building. You see this? He is able to do abundantly above all that we ask or think. And that's not even the end of it. God is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask. And I got to tell you, when we were talking this morning in the passage there in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, where Paul said that Jesus told him, my grace is sufficient for you. And very often when I think about that, I think about this passage here, that God is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us. The grace of God saves us. The grace of God delivers us. The grace of God enables us. The grace of God provides for us. Truly, as our children would often sing at Vacation Bible School, our God is so big, so strong, so mighty. There's nothing our God cannot do. It's time that we older heads develop the same faith that our children have when they sing that song with all the confidence in the world. So what we've done here in examining these passages, we've allowed God to take us out of the valley through a progression and set us on this mountaintop, that we can see the wonders of God in our lives each and every day. So my friend, you yield yourself to the expressed will of the Spirit through the words of Christ. And then you invite Jesus to settle comfortably in your heart by faith. And then allow the roots of God's love to find its way extended deeply into your lives and in the lives of others. And you fill your heart and your life with the awesome power of God. And you will be on God's mountaintop.